No, of course. I was going to just mention that only because
Just going to give them 30 more seconds while we get some extra chairs. As people start taking the last seats, it's a full room. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to or welcome back to the Middle East Institute. My name's Charles Lister. I'm a senior fellow here, a long-time Syria analyst and the director of Countering Terrorism and Extremism. It's my real pleasure today to welcome you to our latest public event, which will be focusing on Syria and specifically on the crucially important role played by women in Syria within civil society, in local and international initiatives seeking to shape a better future for their country and their people. Throughout the last 8 years of conflict, Syria's women have formed the unwavering bedrock of civil society, holding communities together amidst unprecedented adversity. Women have played key roles in mediating local conflicts and issues, managing and administering local councils and service provision bodies, in healthcare, education, countering violent extremism, and in the judiciary. And abroad, Syrian women have been ever present in substantial and increasing numbers in formal peace processes and most recently in the UN-managed Constitutional Committee, of which I should add Jomana is a member. Thanks to the generous support of the Asfari Foundation, the Middle East Institute has over the past year been overseeing a project that's looked more deeply at Syrian civil society and its important role in Syria, while seeking to amplify the voices of civil society so people might better understand the complexity of the crisis and the possible paths to resolve it. This event falls within that civil society project. Now, I should add here at the outset, for those of you who might have been following this event in the past days, that the event's planned moderator, the Wall Street Journal's Vivian Salama, unfortunately had to pull out from moderating this event due to the ongoing impeachment hearings, which some of you may or may not be following these days. So sadly, you're stuck with me. But I, for one, am thrilled to be here alongside three great friends and extraordinary Syrians who I welcome to MEI and to this panel. Sarah Hunaidi, I won't read their entire bios, but Sarah Hunaidi is a Syrian writer, feminist, human rights activist, and member of the Syrian women's political movement. She writes and speaks frequently to the media in both English and Arabic about political and cultural developments in Syria. Her opposition to the regime saw her exiled in 2014, and since then she's begun, amongst other things, working on a book project about missing activist Samira al-Khalil. Rafif Jouejati is the co-founder and director of Free Syria, and is involved in several other organisations, including the local coordination committees, the Day After Project, and Beitna Syria. Rafif is especially active in the Syrian women's movement and has advanced a charter demanding 50% representation of women in all aspects of Syrian governance. And lastly, Jomana Qaddour is a doctoral student at Georgetown University's Law Center, where she's focused on ethno-sectarian political identities and their impact on constitutional frameworks in Syria, Iraq, and Bosnia. Jomana is also a member of, as I mentioned, the Syrian Constitutional Committee. She's the co-founder of Syria Relief and Development, a humanitarian organization that's provided over $75 million of aid to Syria and the region. And she's also a Truman National Security Fellow and the 2019 Center for a New American Security Next Generation Fellow. In addition to the long list, Jomana also serves on the Executive Committee of the American Relief Coalition for Syria and has previously held positions at the US Commission on International Religious Freedom and at Keras Associates. You can read more about today's speakers on our website and on the flyers, which hopefully you picked up on your way into this event today. I'd also encourage you all to join today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag MEISyria. And now I'm going to hop over onto the stage and take over proceedings, hopefully slightly less loudly than that. So without further ado, welcome to all three of you. Really, really glad you could all make it here for this very important panel. I think without further ado, I'm going to give you all some time to provide some opening comments, which hopefully will be all separate and complementary. And as is usual with most of our events here, I'll hop on after that and moderate a brief discussion before opening up to a question and answer session with all of you. So keep that in mind. We're looking forward to a good discussion afterwards, but we'll start with Jomana.
Thank you, Charles, for having me, and thank you, everyone, for making time out of your day to join us to talk about the many other aspects of Syrian women's involvement. So first of all, how we got here. So in December 2015, UN Security Council Resolution 2254 was passed. And within that resolution, it articulated different points that everyone, including the Russians, the Americans, and other members of the Security Council agreed upon. They agreed to stop attacks on medical facilities. They agreed to set up free and fair elections in Syria, a transitioning governing body, safe and voluntary return of refugees, and above all, a ceasefire and unfettered humanitarian access. The other aspect that was in 2254 was the drafting of a constitutional process. Now, that is one of many other things, right? As I mentioned, that was promised in 2254. Our own government here was that we will proceed with the constitutional process. And so that was decided in January 2018, and after almost 2 years of sort of international wrestling over the matter, in late October, the Constitutional Committee of 150 Syrians was finally convened in Geneva. And like you mentioned, I participated as part of that process. Just to give you an overview, and I'm not here to talk about the details of the entire process, but from civil society, of which I am from the civil society group. We are technically, seen as independent actors, and we are there to sort of bring in the civil society voices and expertise that we've gathered over the past several years. Now, I know that a lot of times in the Arab context, women are often seen as, doormats, or they're perceived to be put in certain positions because of other or higher political authorities. And I have to say that no matter what the outcome of the Syrian Constitutional Committee, I've actually had the honor to meet several women who I think are very qualified in their own right as lawyers and as judges. This process overall has involved the most number of women that we've ever seen in any constitutional process. It's about 30%. And then of the 150, they also have a 45-member drafting committee, so there's 15 from each group that are selected. And of the 45, there are 13 Syrian women involved. Now, I'm not going to sit here and give my as feminists, but I would have to say that the two women that are representing the opposition on the smaller committee are members of the Syrian women's political movement, are known for their feminist views, and many of the women who also are representing on the civil society group are also they have a very similar profile in the sense that they are there really to push forward the agenda on Syrian women's rights, both during wartime and hopefully after in peacetime. And there's one woman in specific I wanted to flag. She's a judge, Judge Iman Shahoud. Her story is it's very inspirational because she was a lawyer, I believe, for 13 years in Syria prior to the war, and then she served as a judge for 18. And then the regime, because of her political opinions, and she disagreed, and she created the Independent Syrian Judiciary Council, and she was serving as a judge. And then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or at the time was known as Jabhat al-Nusra, came and they eliminated the participation of women judges. So she once again had to flee Idlib, and she is now residing in Sweden, but she is a member of the drafting committee and of the constitutional committee overall. What are some of the things that women, including myself, are demanding on as part of this committee? And I should just point out that no matter what the ultimate outcome of this process that we're all rightfully skeptical of, I think this process has allowed a lot of Syrian and Syrian American women to be at the table, as opposed to just advisors in the back room, as opposed to women who may, speak just on panels or, run nonprofits. They are participating as political actors in this process and hopefully gaining experience through this so that in future round tables, negotiating tables, they are also present. So first and foremost, many of the women, I don't want to attribute this to all the women participating, but many of the women are demanding a 30% quota. Now, Syria is one of the last Arab countries that actually has not, implemented a quota. Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. There's a few others that have already gone along this path. We can debate whether or not women's quotas alone are effective. I don't think they're effective in and of their own right, but they are definitely necessary to at least get women onto the table. But not just in the legislative branch, in the judiciary, in the security branch, and at the executive. So at all levels of government. Another issue here is that Syrian law is not blind to gender, like in many other Arab countries. The law does differentiate between men and women, and sometimes as Americans we forget how it's not. It was there from the time of the French mandate. It does not punish men and women in Syria equally. It treats men differently than women, and there's a variety of other laws that really distinguish and discriminate against women, laws that have to do with inheritance, with post-divorce matters like custody of the child, etc. So there are many issues that women are seeking to impact and to change. Laws concerning harassment and domestic abuse, citizenship. Women in Syria cannot pass on their citizenship, while Syrian men can pass on their citizenship to their non-Syrian wife and their children. Syrian women cannot do the same. And then finally, president that will lead Syria. Now, you don't have to take my word for it about what Syrian women want to see on, at the table, at the negotiating table discussed. There have been many different groups that have taken it upon themselves to really figure out what are women asking for and how best to achieve those results. So the Syrian Women's Political Movement, of which we are all three members, we're 147 women, 20% of which still reside inside of Syria, 50% which reside in the region, and then the rest, including myself and others, we are in Europe and other places. We've had a series of consultations, over 8 consultations inside of Syria and 1 consultation outside of Syria. 125 women have participated and have really put forth their ideas on a variety of subjects, including what do they want to see in a constitution, how do they feel about reconstruction, and on what's happening in the political space and how international actors should or should not get involved in Syria. There's also the Syrian Women's League that have also done a series of consultations. They've focused on decentralization and the separation of powers and why that's important really to the democratic process, because the more localized you get, the more likely you are to be able to capture answers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jomana. Sarah?
Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Try again. There we go.
Yes, that's much better. So as a storyteller and a writer, today I'm going to be focusing on stories of different women from different backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different classes. And I think as also someone who specializes in Syrian politics, I try to marry political is personal, and what's personal is political, which is one of the first pillars of feminism. So I will focus on a lot of names. Some of them you might have heard of, like Razan Zaytouneh, and a lot of others, Hunaidi al-Khalil, who I'm very biased towards, and I'm writing a book about her. I'm also going to be focusing on civil society, but also how women try to navigate a lot of different spheres, the civil society, politics, their own communities, and they fight on a lot of different arenas in order to sit at the table and to have a voice and to be heard. And unfortunately, how the toll of the whole conflict, forced to marry young or to marry someone who's much older than you, and displacement, how that affects women particularly, women who have been raised to be in a certain role, and then the war took away that role and they lost their husbands, and now they don't have a breadwinner or their children, and how they navigate to participate. They still want to have a say, not just in their own homes, but in politics and in civil society.
Wow. How do I follow these two magnificent ladies? I'd like to reiterate the thanks to you, Charles, for hosting us to Middle East Institute, and for all of you for being here away from that gripping comedy. I've been in, and from the beginning, I always had the same question: where are the women? So in 2011, as if anybody needed a reminder, we started with peaceful protesters demanding dignity and equality and democracy and freedom. And in those peaceful protests, we were women leaders in the hundreds, if not thousands. We had people like Samira Khalil and Razan Zaytouneh and Suhair Atasi and hundreds of others. And we would say, here are the women. The women are protesting and homemakers. They are many, many things. I think starting in 2012, especially as the peaceful revolution began to take up weapons in response to the Assad regime, the narrative began to change. And so our women leaders were starting to be marginalized. This was not by women. This was done by media, both Arab and Western, and by the dominant political narrative. So I looked at media framing. Women went from the sister of, the daughter of, the fiancée of. And in that process, that narrative was an attempt to strip women of their identities as doctors and lawyers and engineers and educators and politicians. What we saw was that it became much more lucrative, more sexy, if you will, for the media to focus on armed conflict and routinely ignore the efforts that average Syrian citizens to care for the needy, to care for the victims. Moving forward from 2012, it's been a downhill spiral, I think, until we were able to form organizations like the Syrian Women's Political Movement. I think because that was the very first women's political movement, very specifically political, it was a feminist movement, proudly so, unapologetically Syrian and feminist, and looking for full equality and looking for seats at the table, whether it's 30% or, in my view, we need to be pushing for 90%, but, whatever. I'll settle for 50%. While media framing has positioned women as victims, I believe the reality is that all Syrians, regardless of our gender, our age, our backgrounds, all Syrians are victims of a brutal dictatorship, of bloodthirsty supporters, and international apathy that makes the international community complicit in a tragedy. And I think that's very important to be said. The two words I come away with going forward, and I tweeted something about this morning, because I think they characterize Syrians, and particularly Syrian women: resilience and perseverance. Resilience because we have people who have had to flee their homes, take their families, rebuild their lives all over the world. Today, there are very few countries in Europe or North America that don't have, or Turkey, there are very few countries in the world that don't host Syrians. And many, many of our Syrian compatriots have risen above the circumstances, and position was created, I believe, in this revolution. We had some of our male representatives say things like, there are no qualified women, as though the men were so qualified themselves. We had people saying, can women form a political party and still cook dinner? So perseverance, I believe, because we've come so far since then. And so I call on all of you, and especially both of you, because you are the next wave of Syrian leaders, I hope you will always begin the conversation with where are the women and demand an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafif. Start with Jomana. Just to dig a little deeper on the Constitutional Committee question. I know this is slightly of a divergence away from the gender issue, but because you spoke so eloquently about the process, and because it's so timely, and because you're a member of the process, it would be interesting just to get your insight. I read a really interesting article this morning by a Russian analyst who called the Constitutional Committee a white elephant, which I assume must be a Russian phrase, but read within the context meant that it was meant to be a distraction. And he said it's by design meant to be a distraction from the more important developments.
Sure.
Do you agree with that? What impressions did you come away from the process? I mean, we've talked personally, but it would be interesting for you to say what you can, at least, to the audience about how that initial meeting went and where you think this is going.
Sure. It's very interesting that that was said by a Russian analyst. I think many Syrians share the frustration that the international community could not come to an agreement except on the Constitutional Committee. Like, I as a constitutional lawyer, I think the Constitution is problematic. There are many issues with the Constitution that need to be fixed. However, Syrians did not go to the street because the Constitution per se was objectionable. It was the entire political system they objected. They objected to one man having full control over their destinies. That is why Syrians went out in protest. And to try to minimize that to essentially a piece of paper of rewriting laws that, it is very unlikely that they will be implemented is almost, what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost insulting. I mean, we have over 1 million Syrians that have died. I'm there to see what me and many of my colleagues who have been involved passionately on working on Syria, whether they're Syrian Americans, Syrian Europeans, or Syrians that had to flee their home. We are there to ensure that at least there is a Syrian voice in this phase. I personally do not think that this is going to lead us to a free and democratic Syria. I would love, if this is the process the international community is moving forward now, I would like to at least insert the voices of good people there. And we reserve the right to leave at any moment. And we're taking that very seriously. As you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of a nonprofit, the majority of who works in Idlib. I have 1,200 staff in Idlib that I personally feel responsible for. And we as Syrians and Syrian Americans have had no control over their destiny in Idlib. So far, the Russians, and yesterday it was a huge massacre in Qah camp that I believe the Iranians, I think they said in the Syrian regime, were responsible for. A smaller committee did last time we were in Geneva is tell Geir Pedersen, we cannot stay here in good faith if you don't do anything about, if they're going to escalate, we have to leave. We saw a de-escalation. I don't necessarily know if the two things were tied. I don't know what's going on in the minds of the Russians, but I do know the Russians want this process very badly. And so we're trying to use any lever we can because frankly, I feel incredibly helpless, like the majority of people in this room, as to what is left to be done. We have protested in every possible way that what is going on is inhumane and constitutes to war crimes on a variety of different levels. And so we're using every outlet we possibly can to relay that message on behalf of the civilians and the marginalized communities, including women. Like I said, I'm deeply skeptical about the outcome of this. Most likely this will lead to some kind of a constitution on paper that an Assad will likely run in 2021 and he will probably win. Hope is that I don't think the people who think they've won Russia, i.e. Iran, who've won Syria, i.e. Russia and Iran, I don't necessarily know what they want to do with Syria over the longer term. I don't think they have a vision for the country, and certainly not a better vision than Syrians themselves about what they want to see. And so my hope is, like all of us, no matter how tired we've gotten, is that we're going to try at every phase, at every opportunity. And I really think unfortunately, that's the most I can do right now. So absolutely. I'll stop there.
And someone has to do it, and I think it's very important that you are. Sarah, as I believe the youngest person on the panel, I wanted to ask you a question about the future.
Yes, don't worry.
We have
in the last 9 years. And one thing that Rafif said in her opening comments was that as challenging and as awful as the last 9 years have been, one thing that's come out of it is that women have mobilized, new voices have been heard, new organizations have been created. So what is your vision, despite the bad, dire outlook inside Syria, but what is your outlook in terms of, is this kind of like an irreversible process? The shouting of new voices, the establishment of an opposition, that will it outlast a military conflict, and what role do women have to play in that?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, I was in high school when the revolution happened, and I didn't know politics. I didn't know anything. I was raised in a very scientific household. I was studying, I applied to med school, I got in, totally different life. But then the revolution happened, and like something in my head just lit. I'm like, what? I can have a say in my country? And I'm not the only one. And I didn't know even role models. They weren't around. I mean, there were great role models in a lot of other spheres, and my mother is one of them. Very successful doctor. There's a lot of doctors, engineers, educated women, mothers. But politically and women who are saying ideas that we are told to not think about. This is what really draw me to the revolution. And unfortunately, it was in a space where in a city that in Syria is very, very strong, with everyone, like the Sunni majority and all the other minorities, but especially also for women, because there's also the fear of our honor. We are the honor of the family, we are the honor of the community. And then if I used to have nightmares, if I get arrested, what will happen to me? Because I heard a lot of stories of honor killings and of women. I had friends who were arrested, for example, and when they got out, they were seen as something like they should hide themselves because we don't know what happened inside, and all the whispers, and this is really heartbreaking because they're just as heroes as in my eyes as everyone else. So something definitely is irreversible in that regard of our ideas, of the younger women as well who send me messages even now, because I started writing in English, but I also kept writing in Arabic because I know that I didn't want to lose this connection with my community. And younger girls just send me emails over Facebook and Instagram. They're like, listen, I can't really do anything about that right now, but I like that you exist. About today. And these things cannot be changed because it changed my life completely. I was supposed to be now a doctor or something, which is really boring in my opinion. But now I get to talk to like-minded people about things that used to be taboos, and that's really interesting. And that's where the future of Syria lies, in these conversations.
Right, great, fantastic. And Rafif, so one thing I mentioned in your introduction, and I just wanted to, what kind of, well, the first question is, what kind of reception has that had over the last 9 years? I mean, has it been a real challenge to continue to push for that 50-50 quota? Mm-hmm. I spent 3 years working in Syrian Track 2, and the amount of women in the room was always a very sensitive topic, both for the women but also for the men. So has that been a challenge? Could there ever become a point where quotas aren't necessary anymore? Do you see that becoming, at least within the communities we're talking about, a sort of reachable reality?
Charles, these are
tough questions.
These are tough questions.
That's why we're here.
It was extraordinarily difficult to talk about 50% representation. I have been called crazy. I have been called an agent of the West. I have been told that I live on Mars. I've been told that I can't possibly be Syrian for dreaming this unthinkable state of equal representation. And yet my group worked with 100 activists inside Syria in opposition-held and regime-held areas, and interviewed more than 50,000 Syrians in 1 year. And based on those interviews, we created the Syrian Freedom Charter, and the respondents, the majority of the 50,000 respondents said they believed in full equality for both genders. So I think I'm going to go back to something you asked. Is this irreversible? And I think yes. Once Syrians have scaled the wall of fear, once they've had a taste of freedom, we're unstoppable. And so I think things like this world, the wonderful initiatives a lot of people are undertaking, all of these point to the inevitable change. Equality is coming. It's not just equality for women, it's human rights, it's human equality in the Syrian context. We're seeing it in the Constitutional Committee. We know that the Assad regime is not going to change a constitution that fails to protect the Assad regime. Just as in Geneva, we never thought the Assad regime would negotiate itself out of a job. But every international initiative has a long-term effect, I think. It has a reverberation inside Syria where future leaders exist, where they don't exist in Syria. And so it's a learning process. I know in 2011, we thought it would be a matter of months. In 2012, we thought it might be another year or two. By 2013, we were thinking, okay, maybe in 2016. And in the last few years, we're saying, is this ever going to happen? And the answer is yes, because we have more young people becoming politically aware. They have no choice because they live in a war zone and they all want something different. They're all learning hard lessons. The more constitutional committees and movements and organizations we have in Syria. So what was the last question? Does that answer your question?
I think you covered it. I think you covered it very well. So let me follow up to all three of you with a big question and a difficult one. I mean, we're sat in Washington. We're not on the Syrian border. Syria, amidst impeachment, seems like a million miles away for most Americans. Syrian issue touched down news screens a few weeks ago because of developments in the northeast with Turkey. But broadly speaking, I think Rafif, you used the word apathy, is becoming increasingly clear. And we hosted a screening of For Summer, the movie, a few weeks ago, and the same issue came up, is why? Why has the international community so consistently been detached, emotively detached, politically detached from this issue? And I think it would be really interesting to get a Syrian women's opinion on that issue, but also whether or not you think there are still things that can be done that keeps Syria as an important agenda item in the US. I realize this probably seems like an almost insensitive question, but it has to be if some of the things that you're talking about are by the world, and I'm looking particularly at the women issue and the civil society issue, two issues that you don't hear a great deal about in the US and in the West in general. So tough question, but we'll start with Jomana, and just interested to hear your opinions.
I mean, when looking at Syria, why, the apathy, I mean, unfortunately, I think Syria just came after a series of other Arab Springs that the United States didn't feel it effectively addressed. And so we weren't able to take the difficult decisions and decisions that might have changed the track. I mean, I don't want to go over the red line. That's been like 6 years ago, but that was a critical moment. And since, I mean, even our most recent pullout, I mean, somehow we've managed to fumble every time it's been a critical moment. And for me, having gone into the Constitutional Committee, before our soldier we had in Syria had like a force field around him, right? Like the regime did not come near our soldiers. There was a real reason for that. It did not want to get into a fight with the United States. I wasn't for permanent presence of the United States in Syria, but there's a responsible way to leave. And I think most people, whether behind closed doors, publicly or privately, would probably agree that this was not the most effective way to burn our capital and our time in the Northeast. There's a, like I said, there were a variety of different, at least to preserve life. I mean, Syrian life that was unnecessarily lost throughout this entire process. But after the US pullout, going into the Constitutional Committee, it really felt like we, especially those of us who were Syrian Americans, were kind of, naked, because it was like we had a presence there that meant something in the face of the Syrian regime. Now, what I think that we might be missing, I've said this to a lot of humanitarian advocacy organizations, is that education we've done a horrendous job on education. Every international actor should be ashamed for how little we've done on education, because it's been almost a decade. There are Syrian kids who are almost 10 years old who have never been to a school, who do not know how to read and write. And the problem is, every time we've talked to different governments about funding, they have no funding for education, including ours here. It's considered stabilization. And that generation of Syrians is going to be a problem for us. And I'm not talking about future terrorists, because I know oftentimes that's how they like to shape them, but I'm talking about people who can actually rebuild the country. They are lacking in critical skills, and it is not easy to fill that 10-year gap that we've, for a lot of us who are here, about rethinking what role the US can effectively play in the region. And it's probably going to be unconventional, because we're looking around. I don't see Syria in a silo of its own. I mean, Syria is in a region that is very troubled, that has a series of failed policy after failed policy. Economic distribution is unequal. There's legal and economic discrimination for everyone in these countries, except it might not be through our military. In some instances, it might be through our military. I am familiar with the MEPI programs and those things. In some instances they work, and in some instances they don't. But I think Lebanon and the Lebanese have done a very good job of telling us what they do want, where they want the U.S. to play a role, and then everywhere where they don't want the U.S. to play a role. And I think it's important that we listen to them. And I really, I wish them luck. They've only been, moving forward for a month. Syria was peaceful for 6 months. Look for new tools or ideas that we can effectively support, and just know when it is time for us to take a step back and let the people in the region take the lead. So,
Sarah?
Thank you. That was really thorough. Kind of the same idea, actually, but I'm tired of repeating here since I came here. I'm like, Syria is not Iraq. Syria is not Iraq. Iraq is not Syria. It's not the same. But I feel like the US is experiencing a post-traumatic response after what happened in Iraq and even in Libya, and now there's kind of a paralysis that's going on. We don't know what to do. Everything we do turns out horrible, which is kind of true. But the answer is not to listen to what they want. But again, Syria is very complicated, because it's really hard to talk to Russia, and Russia is really, really embedded with the Syrian regime. So I can be an idealist and I can say I'm against all interventions, which I have been. I don't want anyone to be in my country. I want us to work our problems together, but that's a very idealistic vision, and I know that. And once Russia and Iran and Hezbollah are in Syria, it became impossible for us to, I don't blame people who are seeking help and asking for someone else to do something, because they're dying. They're not asking because they want stashes of money or dollars. They're like, please save us, we're being killed. So I don't have a simple answer. I would love to have a simple answer, but it's really complicated, and I would love to see, I wouldn't like to see the US in Syria, but I wouldn't like to see Russia and Iran and Hezbollah in Syria either, and all the other fighters who I don't know where they came from that are speak really different languages, and
I look at it from a more international perspective, and I know the United States has not had a sustainable Syria or Middle East policy for decades. We know that. We know that very typically many of the European countries will follow the American lead. Okay, we know that. But what I really believe is at play here is that those countries over there, those brown-skinned people over there, simply do not matter. And this is just another Holocaust. It is the Syrian Holocaust. It is the Arab Holocaust. Today, we've lost 1 million people. If we keep at it for another 9 years, we'll be at 10 million people. And the criminals go unpunished, the violence continues, and really the final tragedy is that this is a humanitarian and human catastrophe. And this is kind of a stain on international history. And so I started out with framing theory. I'm sure historians will reframe this conflict. In many cases, it's already been reframed as an Islamist versus a secular regime. These kinds of platitudes and stupid statements, very shallow statements, actually help perpetuate international apathy, where leaders can say, we don't know what to do, it's too complicated. Or they say other really stupid and shallow things like it's the Sunni-Shia divide, as though the international community simply doesn't care. And there have been the Libyas and the Iraqs and the Afghanistans, and people are tired of war and tired of hearing about death and destruction, and they're paralyzed. But at the end of the day, if it's not in my backyard, I don't care. And that's the message I have been getting from the international community. So I go back to my favorite 2 words of the day, resilience and perseverance. Because even though we've lost 1 million Syrians, and even though we have an entire generation that's going without an education, I believe that Syrians around the world are learning. I think our voices will ultimately be heard, because the upside of the refugee crisis is now we speak English and German and Swedish and Turkish and a multitude of other languages, and we are making our voices heard. So,
absolutely.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we should have about half an hour to open it up. So the question is about so-called reconciled areas that have been recaptured by the regime. And I want to ask specifically about the female experience, the women's experience in those areas. If you're familiar with it, what has reconciliation looked like for ordinary civilians, and specifically the women's community, whether we're talking about East Ghouta, southern Syria, around Homs, or anywhere else for that matter. And we can start in the same order or whatever order you 3 would like. But Jomana.
Unfortunately, I don't have enough about the specific women's experience. 6 months on Homs with Carnegie Beirut. So I looked at this a little bit. I was actually born in Al-Wa'ar, which was one of the neighborhoods of the Homs that was most bombarded by the government because it was a well-known opposition stronghold. What's happened in many of these areas is initially you see sort of the Russian presence come in, keep some order. Initially they don't take in a lot of the opposition soldiers or the civilians that have said, we won't protest against the regime, local council leaders, etc., that in exchange for their own safety and their lives agree to surrender. And so initially, like I said, the Russians come in and there's some semblance chaos where, hundreds, and there's been many reports of hundreds of Syrians who have been captured, detained. They're sometimes brought in on terrorism charges. They're brought in to go, then they're sent to the front lines in Idlib. People who had been told that you have, for example, a year where you don't have to worry about being conscripted. The promises, of course, are overturned by the government, and it goes and picks them up and will accuse their neighbors of stealing something just to have them detained. And so we've seen different kinds of sort of mass detention, and I think it is very deliberate to kind of keep fear at the hearts of Syrians so that they don't dare rebel again. But in addition to this, and this is something tied to the greater reconstruction topics that I don't know if anyone was going to ask any questions about this, but the areas of Homs that are being rehabilitated are deliberately areas that were solely loyal to the regime and other institutions, in the face of those areas that had been largely majority Sunni Arab and had rebelled against the regime. So this is one, in sort of really exploiting sectarian tensions that have accumulated over the years. It's not an accident. It's a very deliberate and systematic method that the regime uses to continue to develop cleavages in Syrian society. It does not want reconciliation. It does not want rehabilitation of Syrian. The more, and we, by the way, we see this even in the Constitutional Committee, like there is a deliberate effort to continue to keep Syrians separate from one another, that those who rebelled are terrorists and that only those who are loyal are humans and should be treated as citizens by the Syrian government. So
Right.
I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Jomana. And Sarah, I should just add, as part of this, if you want to also address it or address it instead, it would be interesting to hear about the situation in Sweden and the Druze community, and an area that's been negligibly touched by the conflict, but in other ways has entirely been affected by the conflict. Might also be interesting to hear about that.
So in Sweden, unfortunately, a lot of the men have either migrated or died or under detention. Actually, not a lot of people know part of the problems between the regime and the Druze community is that the Druze community refused to let their men fight and go kill other Syrians. So they, in the community of the Druze, the sheikhs, the religious leaders have really strong saying. So when they say that we're not going to send our regime and the Syrian community. So what I hear a lot, which is sometimes is funny to hear, like women are annoyed because there are no men. They want to get married and they want to have children and they want to have lives and there are no men. Where are all the men? We don't know. But the more dark side of it is that, or sometimes even empowering, it's a double-edged sword. Women are more empowered now because they have the arena to themselves. They are starting businesses and they're protected by their community because the Druze community is also self-controlled. The people who have arms are from the community themselves. So everyone who is not from the community is seen as an outsider, including the Assad regime. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we see a lot of intimidating the Assad regime, but you can always find clashes between the community and them. And sometimes those clashes involve women because, again, it's a conservative society and women are the center, they're the honor. You can't really look at them wrong or treat them wrong or whatever. So yeah, there's a good side to men not being there, just like after the World War I and II, but also there's a bad side of inner conflicts and the economy is really affecting, everyone.
Mm-hmm,
so
mm-hmm. Great, fantastic, thank you. And Rafif?
So yeah, women are now, but the bottom line is reconciliation at gunpoint is not reconciliation, right? So that's kind of the bottom line. People are sick of war. They're sick of being tortured. They're sick of having their loved ones imprisoned or killed or disappeared. They want to go back to some semblance of a normal life. And this is not capitulation to the Assad regime. And this is certainly not reconciliation because, again, reconciliation at gunpoint. This is survival. This is actually resilience. This is knowing that you can, especially as a woman, help to rebuild your community, find a few good men and rebuild what you can. This is the very essence of resilience, and I think this is what's going to carry Syria forward, not reconciliation looking down the barrel of a...
Viewers, just before you ask your question, please identify yourself just so we know who you are. But if you raise your hands, we'll start on this row, gentleman on there, and then you on the end.
I'm very interested. I'm very interested in concerning women participation or what women leading these movements, who shows us the level of the conservatism. They appreciate. One of the fears of the women is that they are the reposition or the reservoirs. That's some of the issues that women face in society, conservative societies, because they can't do this, because if they do it, what will be of their husband, their sons, of their relatives. So I want to understand the role men play in the supportive of their wives to lead the front runners, or is it when their husbands are not there, then that's when these women be able to speak out. But, if we can be able to institute that, even in the present that Syria and equal rights, 50%, 30% can be very much applicated to men.
Great, fantastic. And then we'll take one more question. This lady at the end on the second row, on the far end.
I'll just use my natural voice too. I'm sorry, I just couldn't see when I was sitting down. My name is Madison Scicchia. I'm a grad student at the National Defense University here in DC, and I'm actually writing my thesis on the role of Syrian women leadership in Reconstruction. My question is actually, so I'm researching the Syrian women's political movement, and I'm researching Women Now for Development and all of that. And so I'm kind of wondering what, in your opinions, what you think, you talked about it a little bit, but what you think makes Syrian women uniquely capable in leading reconstruction and peace efforts?
Great, thank you. Okay, a couple questions. Rafif?
So I just want to start by saying these are excellent questions, and thank you for raising them. But I'm afraid we are somehow characterizing Syrian women as one monolithic body. And so I do want to point out that Syrian women come from very diverse backgrounds. We are light-skinned and dark-skinned. We are Christian, we are Jewish, we are Armenian, we are Assyrian, we are Sunni, Shia, we are everything. Syria, culturally and religiously and ethnically, is a melting pot. So is in having a population articulate its belief for the first time in more than 50 years. And so this is where the rebuilding for us internally as Syrians begins, and as women secondarily. Now, in some communities, there is no choice. The woman is the breadwinner. The men are either in jail or dead or kidnapped or completely disappeared, right? So women are doing what they need to do. Very often they do have children, or they have other family members they need to take care of. So I think in many communities in Syria, it's no longer an issue of honor, it's an issue of survival. In still other communities, they have been through almost 10 years of war. The question then to say, I am protecting my virginity, or I'm covering my body, or I'm refusing to admit to my femininity. So I think the discussion on honor has also changed a little bit in different communities throughout Syria. It's been 9 really long years for men and women. And I don't think we can classify us as one group. So I just wanted to get that out there.
Great.
Thank you.
Jomana, Sarah, either of you?
Yeah, I wanted to also comment on that. I can't really answer if all men are supportive to their wives or not. I know a lot of instances, actually a lot, that have been very crucial to their wives or their partners' activism, and sometimes the opposite. So I'm going to mention different stories and names. I'm going to start with Razan Zaytoun, who I mentioned at the beginning. She and her husband are partners in the revolution and in their struggle, and she was a human rights lawyer. She is a human rights lawyer, and her husband is also an activist and in his own right. And they worked together in the Human Rights Violation Documentation Center in Douma, in the Syrian Women's Political Movement. I actually was talking to her yesterday, and she was telling me about her husband, how supportive he is. And she admittedly says that she comes from a conservative Muslim community, and that not only her husband is supportive of her, but also her children. When sometimes she has long days, working as a civil society leader and a politician in the making, I believe I would vote for her as a president. But she always says that her family is very, very supportive of her, and she couldn't done the job that she is doing without them. On the other hand, I know someone named Maryam who, in the beginning of the revolution, she trained as a nurse, and she went to rebel-held areas, and she started to help people. And when she got arrested, unfortunately, after she got out, her husband divorced her. He took away her custody over her children, and she was kicked out from her family's home. So her own parents did not take her. And of course, that did not break her. She is a force of nature. I learned from her so much. She's an outspoken person. She is amazing. And now she has a new partner who is very supportive, and she has a new kid with him. So again, I love how stories just represent, you know, how diverse the community is, and it's not one answer.
Jomana?
I'm not going to add more to my colleagues' stories. I think that's just like all societies. You have some components that help strengthen the female voice, and then there are some that will try to suppress them. We're certainly not immune to that here in the United States, despite it being. With regard to Reconstruction, I don't necessarily think that women are going to be more capable of men. That's not how I see it. I think, going off of what Rafif said, it's really just about giving space for everyone whose lives are impacted by the decisions to have a voice at the table. The women's quotas, and I don't really believe in quotas in general. Women's quotas is the only quotas I actually believe in, and for the specific Syrian context. And it's because when left to their own devices, institutions do not naturally gravitate to incorporating the female voice or other marginalized voices, but especially the female voice. And the female voice is 50% of the population. Whereas, you may have certain, religious minorities and things like that. Like, I think there are different ways to deal with those issues. I'm not for setting ethno-sectarian states, but for women, it's from all backgrounds that are impacted. And so finding a way to develop a cadre of women who can engage in a very sophisticated way politically, they just need some space. They need you to just not block that, don't stand in front of the door so that they can stand up. And we don't need anyone to talk for ourselves. We all, and I would say that, going back to what I mentioned about the Syrian Women's League, and also the Syrian Women's Political Movement, the reason they talked about Reconstruction and, in the Syrian Women's League, they were talking about decentralization is, like I said, going back to making sure that this is how democracies function, so that you have more of the governed, the voices of the governed that are captured when you are making critical decisions. And so, like I said, I think Syrian women have also been oppressed by the system under the Assad regime. It's really just making space for all those voices to be heard, and the women that are sometimes more severely suppressed. Just get the.
Okay, wow, lots of questions. Let's take three this time. So we'll start right here in the corner. We'll start moving our way back.
Hi. Hello. Hi, I'm Lorraine. I will just
Microphone problems today.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lorraine. I'm a policy fellow at the Americans for Free Syria. So thank you so much for being with us today here. And the first question I have for you is, have you ever encountered any really big challenge in your professional career when you try to advocate for the Syrian conflict? And if so, how do you overcome that? And the second one is a more personal related question, because I'm from Hong Kong and there's a lot of protests going on, and I'm studying here at the American University. So I have been really trying to help my community back there. But I wonder, so how do you do that is related to you really personally, emotionally or just physically? How do you manage that? Thank you so much.
Excellent questions. Let's start moving a bit further back. So we'll take these two ladies right in the middle. You two.
No microphone. My name is Yasmin Kelly. I'm here from Lebanon. I'm from the I'm here from Lebanon. I'm Syrian. I'm here from Lebanon, and I'm from listening to the rest I wanted to go back to your comment about women and how we all come from all different.
That one should work. It might help.
Sorry. Yeah, how we all come from very different backgrounds and very different cultures. Do see that there is a certain dynamic of the Syrian family that has changed. This is definitely attributed to the fact that we have broken free from the chains as a whole population, be it men or women. But that has then affected women more because they have been put on the brink and they have been challenged in the way they used to do things, especially where they needed to take a stance and they needed to lead the family. This definitely changed the track and the way things are going. And yes, it's going to lead to them rebuilding Syria. We have to be the ones to rebuild. Where are the men? They're injured and they're dead, and it's not Germany, yes, but it is us, and it is a different dynamic that we are dealing with today. I would have never been able to speak like this, and it's not because my parents oppressed me, no. But would I have ever been able to stand up and say, I want to lead and I want to rebuild my country? No. So there is a dynamic that did change at all levels of society. That's all.
Informational. So my name is Jaya. I'm from an international NGO called the World Justice Project. So my question kind of revolves around the role of civil society organizations throughout this peace process and hopefully post-conflict. What do you see as the role, both like international ones and national/local ones in Syria?
Great, thank you. Some good questions. Rafif?
Go ahead. All right.
Kick off.
Hong Kong, I salute you. I really salute you. One thing, we were the biggest network of secular, nonviolent activists, and part of my job was helping stimulate creative civil disobedience and then talking about it internationally. To the extent that you can maintain a nonviolent stance, you have the moral high ground. When the authorities begin shooting, you have to be able to communicate with activists to make sure not so much as a stick comes to the protests. And I know that I know from Syria how we actually had monitors at protests to make sure anybody who came, even looking armed, was sent back home. Of course, the authorities are always stronger, and when the Assad regime released thousands of prisoners into the protests with arms and said, go stir up trouble, that it was all over for us. How you get through it, how you reconcile being in the United States or being at AU, I'm an alum, you get through the day, you do what you can, you recognize that carve out a role for yourself, I think. Please help me if you think I'm not saying the right thing, but I think you just get through it and know that you're fighting the good fight. You will be depressed, you will be frustrated, you may walk away several times. I think we all have at different points in our lives because we are human, but as long as we fight the good fight, I think we stand for something. In terms of women being liberated from the Syrian context, absolutely. We have been politically oppressed, socially oppressed, sexually oppressed, economically oppressed. So there's a whole lot of oppression that has to be overcome. And one thing I admire so much about Syrian women is that we now stand up very tall and we say what we think without fear of consequences. And if there are consequences, we face them like a woman. And so that is just sort of furthering what you said. I'm not sure if there was a question, but I thought your commentary was very powerful. So thank you for that.
I'll just address the question of the civil society group in the Constitutional Committee. And so there are, for reasons I'm not going to go into now, of the civil society group, there are 29 that the Syrian government has chosen, and then there are 21 that I'm included, that the opposition has chosen, but many of whom are really independent, free actors who have been working in the civil society space. And I have to say that, for me, one of the most moving things was when we were in the Palais in Geneva, and there are 150 Syrians, there were 94 speeches that were said. There was so many speeches. It was just,
That's a lot.
but of those 94 speeches, the speeches that were given from the 21 that I would say were independent members of civil society, like that was the first time I think people from the Syrian government side had heard what it was like to really be a free Syrian who was able to say what he or she wanted. And the values we were articulating were values that were not just for me as someone who is opposed to, Bashar al-Assad, but they are things for all Syrians. We were talking about citizenship rights for everyone, the right of women, political development for everyone. And I was asking for my rights as well as theirs, to just be treated with dignity and respect, and not to be killed just because I have an idea that is, that doesn't comply with the ruling party. And so I think, but that and the way we were organized during the Geneva process and how we've been organizing since, in terms of our, we're having Skype calls regularly, and we've set an agenda, and we have ideas about what constitutional articles that we're most interested in, even if the regime isn't taking this process seriously. But just because we've been working on this for 8 or 9 years. We've been preparing. Just want a chance to talk about substantive issues that impact their lives as well as ours. Everyone is tired of fighting. Even people who are opposed to Assad are tired of fighting. But we need to meet certain milestones. And those milestones are the things that we have actually, I was actually surprised. I was looking around, I was like, we would have never been here 8 or 9 years ago, because just the idea of organizing on a mass scale with people inside the country, people who are being bombed, people in America, people in Europe, but like we've somehow gotten it to where all that work with all of our networks, it's finally being tested. And like I said, it might be, we may still have another 10 years, but that process will continue to be refined. But that, and I have to say, that's where I do give some of the international community credit, is the actors that have financially, but we still have a long way to go.
Just a quick follow-up, just for context. In Syria, civil society did not exist, right? You know that there is no such thing in Syria as an NGO. We only have GOs, right? Right. So the concept of rallying and mobilizing and having a platform, any sort of platform, the concept of having more than 5 people at your house at one time, which is illegal in Syria, right? Yes. These are concepts that now we have emerging leaders who have adopted and who are implementing and disseminating to next generation leaders. And so this has contributed, the whole civil society question, and you're right, we thank the international community for helping that along. That has really changed the narrative among Syrians and is changing the outlook for Syria's future.
These two in the front and you in the front. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks. My name is Hannah. I work at Mercy Corps. I was wondering, what do you think has been the role of international NGOs in relation to civil society organizations? Have they mostly succeeded in supporting them, sometimes pushed them to the side? Now, when reconstruction is very politically sensitive, what would you like to see international NGOs doing in Syria?
Okay. Great question. Lady right next to you.
Hi, my name is Arveen Woods. I work with the Syrian NGO Center for Civil Society and Democracy. Unfortunately, Varaja Altali could not be here, but she would have been a much better speaker than me. She would have loved this, and thank you for your wonderful comments. And actually, you touched on this a bit already, which is I wanted to know more about this lightning bolt. So I wanted to hear more about what do you think are the better ways that we can engage communities on the ground inside Syria, including women and youth, on the Constitutional Committee as on the topic of political engagement and their rights, as well as the wider Syrian diaspora. Thank you.
That's another good question. And this lady right.
Thank you for all your valuable comments. It's been very informative and special to listen to. My question has to do with the more immediate future. I'd like to know where you see the role of Syrian women in the next month, 6 months, since as we've all acknowledged, this is probably not a situation that is going to find a solution in the near future. And yet we need to start paving the ground to be able to have reconstruction, to have a democratic process. So I would...
Okay. 3 big questions.
I'll just address the Constitutional Committee question and leave the rest to you all.
Link 2 of the question, 2 of the CCSD. No, CCSD is yours. Just civil society organizations. The Day After Project which has been around since the very beginning, and Beytna Syria. And Beytna Syria, as some of you may know, distributes micro grants and other assistance inside Syria. We're very grateful to the international donors, but I'm reminded of a little news clip I saw of an Irish NGO writing to the public at large. It was, "Thank you for requesting these reports. Please send more money. We're happy to do monitoring and evaluation. Please send more money." Part of the problem I see with dealing with INGOs is that there is so much bureaucracy and so much paperwork that it often gets in the way logistically of what we can do. I'm sure our Lebanese counterparts can do this work, but we need more. And we need some of the programs to be allowed to be self-directed. Very often, and now I'm not speaking about the day after or Beytna, but very often donors want to set the agenda for a program. And that almost defeats the purpose. And so if I want to create a women's empowerment program, I don't want to be told that I need to do something about armed combatants, right? I don't want somebody else telling me what program is going to benefit my constituency. And so that's a message I would send back to them. In mobilizing, we're encouraging women to step up and speak out and participate at the table, at the political table. I think we should be doing more. I believe very strongly, and I've been pushing this now for some time, I believe very strongly that we need to start mentoring younger women. And I think we need to start seeking international support for institutes, leadership training, public speaking training, political training. I think that's where we need to do more so that as the Constitutional Committee, I'm segueing to you, as the Constitutional Committee continues in its meetings, we are developing a new crop of leadership where when a man says there are no qualified women, we can say, I always have to swear, we can say bullshit. Here's a list of 30 or 50 or 100. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Necessarily describe the Constitutional Committee as an opportunity. I think it's something that it's been put on our table, whether we like it or not, and we're trying to maximize as many positives as we can from that experience. And I think many of my colleagues who are on the committee feel the same way. So I want to say that at the forefront. I think the space, and this is what I've told international donors that are interested in supporting, is that there is a lot of work to be done in connecting both the side of the opposition as well as the civil society group to people who are actual members of civil society, both inside of Syria and in Europe and in the United States. Me and my colleague Muna Jundi, who are both Syrian American lawyers, we are very active in the Syrian American community. We have done calls with the community here, and the Syrian American diaspora is, I think, a source of pride for me. We're one of the most active. We are the most active. $50 million worth of aid alone from Syrian American, the community. So, we're trying to leverage sort of what the Syrian American community can provide in the best way possible. So what we've been trying to do is hold different, calls and meetings with them to see what kinds of things do you want to see in this process? What are things most concerning to you? What do you need in order to develop trust between people who are on the committee and people who are on the ground? The same kind of conversations are happening in Idlib, they're happening in Damascus, although to a much more, hush-hush extent, just because given all the security measures that have to be taken there. So that's what I would say about that. Just on Mercy Corps, since just to follow up on what Rafif said, I think that I remember when I started Syria Relief and Development in 2011, it was very much a donor-run agenda, and we just did whatever the donors said, even if it was not beneficial, even if it did not fit the context. But I would have to say 8 or 9 years later, our teams on the ground largely develop proposals for their needs, for how they, it's far from perfect. We still deal with frustration from sort of that relationship. But overall, I think the INGOs have come a long way on the humanitarian side to allow us more space to design and implement the projects as we see fit.
Great. Sarah?
I was also going to comment on, I was also going to comment on that, on your question. I worked for several years in Turkey and in Lebanon and inside of Syria with NGOs before I knew Washington existed. But I also I hope what you're like the developments that you're saying are actually like people are listening. But at the time, and as someone both from the community and is trying to work in an NGO to help, there was a huge gap between people who are who come from these countries that we exist in now and the community. And this huge gap results in a lot of missed opportunities and money going to waste and people not helped enough, and they're actually helped to rely more on the help of this money instead of being self-sufficient, which was really, a couple of years later, I was like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore, because it breaks my heart to see how much people work, but at the same time, the bureaucracy, the misunderstandings, the cultural differences, the people who totally have huge distance between the community is resulting in really bad results. But on that side, there are still people who did not give up on it, did not just go to writing and just start like writing people up. And like you did, you made a huge mistake. They need to listen more. Yes, you have the money means you have the power, but you don't want people to keep relying on you. Yeah.
So work in progress. Perhaps they need more female leaders.
Oh.
So we're a little over time.